I'm Rainey Mullen, and this is Pen and Poet. Intimate conversations and performances with poets, both page and stage, established and up and coming, a safe space where you can meet new artists, maybe gain an appreciation for the spoken and written word. This is poetry for the rest of us, the reachable, understandable, digestible poetry.
That night, Zapata washed my feet. Handlebar whiskers scratched the itch between my legs like myth.
On the days of our births, we breathe the dust of these memories, and it scours our flesh, smooths our skins, fills our lungs.
All the dead desire most is to live in our memory. All they desire most is to laugh and to dance.
I'm here with my guest, Kristian Ashley Macaron, who is a poet and writer from Albuquerque. She received her MFA from Emerson College and has taught workshops and at UNM Valencia. Kristian is an editor for Manzano Mountain Review Literary Journal and writes for Brewer's Crew magazine. Her poetry collection, Storm, was published by Swimming with Elephants. Kristian, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Rainey.
And I also want to congratulate you on, I think, now your second time on the stage for the Women of the World,
Yes.
Final stage here. So yay, congrats on that.
Thank you. It's fun.
And as I do with everybody, just so that listeners can get a sense of who you are, I'm just going to ask you to read a poem right out the gate. Totally your choice.
Okay. I can start by reading this poem. It's called In the Trenches of the Cimarron Canyon. It was published in the Philadelphia Stories magazine, I think in 2015.
Excellent.
In the trenches of the Cimarron Canyon. When La Llorona met Billy the Kid in the trenches of the Cimarron Canyon, the world was black with smokestacks, burning as buildings became tumbleweeds. The scars of the trees were brighter than the mountains, now rounded hills of charcoal, and we were all mountain men, bleary-eyed and mad with thirst. From the gorge under the great gray palisade cliffs, we see the flames light the sky, and it makes us wild like the men who first laid their hands on fire, who burned off their fingerprints so that we cannot find them beyond bones and needles and old spearheads stuck into the ground like pennies in a gutter. Billy raises his six-shooter, left-handed, crooked smile unburied. His famous laugh breaks the wailing woman's cry, and she stops and listens to his voice rattle like a baby snake. And he says, "We're all made of wild things. We're made of touch, of caress, and of the way your eyes flutter over me." She doesn't know whether to rip him open with her desperation or to meld hers with his somehow in the midst of the burning world. And how I want to be there in that ocean where Noah's Ark rocked away in the darkness, the world underneath knew in that ancient tumbler of boulders, and I'd be as smooth and as slick as a sugared strawberry. Finally, La Llorona says, "There's no space here in this air, in the remaking for old sharpness. The love here moves us, makes us wild to understand." And removed, I think, here in the gorge under the walls of these stone giants, I have found the kind of twister that slung Slewfoot Sue into oblivion. I wonder, I've forgotten, if she wore her wedding dress, her veil twisted and gauzy with creek water, as she rode, wielded, conquered, crashed that mammoth catfish into the howling moon. I wonder if the twister made her hot like the desert sea of sand and rattlers, made her cool down in the night like a bride uncovered, make her mad like the catfish who could live out of water, alive like an inside-out stallion, its inside a flurry of flesh and fur, and a dazzling mane that set free would have colored the wind on the plains. On the day when the giants froze into mountains, staring at each other across the Cimarron River, the moon wolves yelped and withered into coyotes, howless and brown like dirt. And our legends met our ghosts with pistolas and lacrimas. On the days of our births, we breathe the dust of these memories, and it scours our flesh, smooths our skins, fills our lungs. And God says at each beginning and beginning again that it is good, that we are perfect, and we breathe now, as we breathe again, and we continue our remaking. But the earth is cracked like a battleground, like footsteps, like a mine of years and stones, rough and brilliant, sharp and smooth.
Excellent. Yay. Thank you. And much like most of your poems, it ends with a bit of hope, which I really appreciate since most of mine doesn't.
Thank you.
What then made you, why Billy the Kid?
Well, growing up in New Mexico, I had a huge fascination with outlaws and also Wild West stories. A lot of my family is from the Wild West regions of New Mexico, and that's the time that they all came and started living here, which is really interesting to me. I like that idea that our legends are not necessarily the most triumphant, that they're mixed with hope and also despair and also things that we like to still learn about and hear about. And it's very much a pervasive part of the place in New Mexico.
That's awesome. Then have you been to Lincoln County, where all of
I've been to Fort Sumner. I have never been to Lincoln County.
Oh,
That is
no.
definitely something that I need to do soon.
It's one of my favorite little spots, because they have a whole little town, and they've got a little museum that's all just for Billy the Kid. So no, that was way cute. Little spot.
He's fascinating because he's so infamous and legendary, but he was, a real person.
Yeah. How much of your family's history then do you know about the coming here during that period?
I know quite a bit. I know part of my mother's family grew up in a ghost town, Dawson, a coal mine. And then my dad's family they immigrated in the end of the 1880s, so right straight into Cimarron and Trinidad. So that was, right at the time that the Wild West was kind of exploding. And
That's cool, because Melanie, my wife, and I actually do a lot of ghost towns because we're relatively new here. We moved here in 2010, and we just like weekend drives of going in a direction, and it's so fascinating that there's dozens and dozens of ghost towns that you can kind of just go and see what things used to be. And I have to say that's one of the few I haven't been to, and now I'm gonna have to make a point to go there.
you should. I saw it actually for the first time this summer.
Oh, really?
And I don't know that it's open all the time. I'm not sure.
Oh, is that the one that you actually have to pay?
I don't think so.
No? Okay.
Every time I've driven past it, since my whole life, we've, I think, stopped at, there's a gate. And so we've stopped at the gate a couple of times. But I was actually there last summer and the gate was open. Ooh. So that was a pretty magical moment.
Yay. So you actually got to see it. Is there a fair number of buildings still there?
No, there's, I think, maybe 2. And then there's a cemetery.
That's usually the best parts.
Yes.
All right, excellent. So then what got you into poetry?
I've been writing for, years, since I was probably in 3rd grade or before. I love poetry. I love the idea of the image saying more than it should, or more than it seems like it will. And it almost always does. I write fiction, dramatic writing, but poetry seems to always have been my most, the one that I gravitate towards most naturally. And that's because I like to look for the subtext, and I like to see what meaning can come out, and how you can say such important things with so little words.
Nice, that's awesome. That's kind of what got me into it too. And I have to say I'm a relatively new poet person, but in terms of your book collection that we'll be chatting about, Storm, there was a collective book reading at Bookworks recently, and that was when I at least think I was introduced to Storm. I've heard you both last year and this year at Women of the World,
right.
And I have terrible memory, so I don't remember any of the poems that you've done, or anybody does actually. But I gravitated toward your collection because I actually grew up in northeastern Connecticut.
Okay,
That's where
cool.
I spent first 20 years of my life. And the way you describe, nor'easters and those hardened piles of snow that turn into like essentially rock that stick around till May if you get the right spots in the parking lot corners.
That was shocking to me.
Yeah, so it was really cool to have somebody who at least I thought was born and raised and only lived here to be able to get that so close and so accurate, and also that kind of eerie silence that kind of descends on towns and cities right before those big storms hit, where the snow hasn't really started, but it just kind of everybody disappears and it's absolute silence. You captured that really well. And I wanted to ask kind of where you were when you decided to kind of piece those together into the collection.
It was actually right after I moved back from Boston to Albuquerque. So fall of like 2014. I had spent about like between 2010, 2014, almost 5 years in Boston. Oh, wow. And when I moved back, I was in a very displaced part of my life. So I was coming back home, but I was also leaving a home to my hometown, which had changed a lot. But I was also leaving a place that had become very much a home to me and a place I love very much. And with that, also displacement of my own identity and from my relationships with friends and others, and so I was feeling very much I didn't quite understand how I was going to move past that. So that's when I started writing about the poems, or about Storm. It's the very first thing that I wanted to write about was the hurricane cake.
Nice. And that was one of the things I was actually going to ask you about specifically, and just to kind of chat about how much of that was true and how much of that, just kind of...
Everything in Storm is totally true.
Oh, that's awesome. And also not so much. So when you were piecing it together, and for those who haven't read Storm yet, it's a collection of 5 poems, all named after nor'easters, I think. So big northeastern storms. And did you actually kind of write them kind of intending to kind of piece them as one collective, or...
It started with the hurricane cake. So I wanted to write about one of my very best friends was supposed to get married, and her wedding was displaced by the storm Irene in 2011. And so what happened is she called me and she's like, I know it's raining, but we have all this wedding cake. Do you want to come over and help us eat it? And, they got married a couple of weeks later, and it was a beautiful wedding, but they were supposed to get married on a boat, and so that was not going to happen during the hurricane. So I knew I wanted to write about that moment, and I was honestly very surprised with what the poem Irene turned into. And that's when I knew that I needed to continue this cycle. And so after I finished Irene, I went into the next year, and the next year was Sandy. And then that's when I knew that I needed to continue the process and the cycle.
Were there any that didn't make the cut?
No, was all.
These are all 5. All right. Then can we hear one?
Sure.
Be it Irene or otherwise?
Do you have a preference?
Not at all, because I have a feeling we're going to chat about most of them.
Okay. I can read Irene.
Okay.
Irene, 2011. The second year came with Irene, And I was no longer a naive Burkina transplant, but Irene was a cold nor'easter bitch, sprung from an icy ocean. Then I lived in a converted, unheated bedroom. But that season was a muddy August in Boston, and bunkered in for the storm, the terrible house never felt so warm. The phone rang with the news that my lover's sister got engaged, and he, in depression, lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling as the rain held him there. Restless, I walked to the market. The wind sailed me down the sidewalk. Inside the store was lit with sunflowers that brightened and beckoned. I brought one home and set it with its sunbeams on his bureau to placate the rain that wrapped him. That he never even looked at it was Irene's greatest damage to me. But hurricanes last for 100 years when you are alone inside them. That day my friend was supposed to be married on a ship in the harbor, sailing between islands on a summer water that held its history in its waves. The second phone call on Irene's day was the bride. "We have all this cake," Rachel said, "but Irene, you know. Will you come over?" Desperate to leave, I begged him to go with me. "It's hurricane cake," I said finally, "hurricane cake." And at that time he loved me more than the rain, so he rose from his soft coils and storm binds, and we walked 1/2 mile in the wind. The rain slashed our toes, wrecked our bodies, drenched our hair, our skin, and everything waterproof. But we were good New Englanders, and only Irene's name, my mother's phone calls, and the broken branches on the sidewalks caused our missteps. As I walked from the steep steps of Wallingford down the train tracks on Commonwealth to the bricks on Sutherland, past the boarded-up liquor mart and the quiet college houses, I waited for the destruction Irene was meant to bring. Irene's cold boil, Irene's broken trees, Irene's swelling ocean. Irene never left me. Soft, I still feel it. The rain starts, the ocean sways. The whole city can feel it.
So lovely. Thank you. And since this is one that I was going to ask about a particular quote, and I had already asked you before we hit record if it was okay to talk about this. This one actually kind of hit me hard, that second, I guess, stanza about the sunflowers and how Irene's greatest damage to you was that he didn't even ever look at the sunflower. And I haven't really talked about it on the podcast yet, but my own poetry tends to revolve almost entirely around my mental health struggles. And so as someone who, it seems, has largely only seen this from the outside, I was wondering if you could talk about, if you're comfortable with it, the kind of dealing with somebody else who's in that place, and how that kind of affects you, I guess.
I think and a lot of this is subtext in Storm. This was someone I cared about very much, and it was a difficult thing for me to observe. But I know that everyone has to deal with their mental health issues or depression issues on their own and in their own way. So I think that I was grasping in a lot of these moments for ways that I could help from the outside, and tried very, very hard. So it was the sunflower moment for me was kind of a realization that there was not much I could do, and that was okay, but it was something I had to also learn to be okay with, but still continue to do.
And like I said, that line and a few others kind of hit really hard for me, at least, who's largely only on the giving side of that struggle, but that your collection still ends on such a hopeful note, And I don't think I'm kind of giving anything away by talking about the last line, since the last line's also on your website. So I want to kind of talk about that last line about, and I'll quote it here. And I know, soft, I can feel it, what kind of storm I am not. And curious as to what that not is.
What the not is. A lot of the preconceptions and truths about storms like of this caliber are that they're very damaging, that they, break trees and destroy homes and, lives even. And I think a lot of this investigation and writing these poems for me was to realize, like, there are lots of different kinds of water, and even water that, can hurt is also something that can heal. That was really important for me to realize that my storm was not his storm, and maybe separate out myself after reflecting on each of these moments.
That's awesome. That's so awesome. That
Thanks.
Usually takes a very long time for people to come to that. I know Melanie and I have been together for more than 10 years, and it's probably only very recent that she's kind of come to terms with the whole his battle isn't my battle sort of thing, and we're separate entities in that regard. Let's see. So then your degree is MFA, right?
Right.
Was creative writing then?
Yes, fiction specifically.
Yeah. So, and I only found one of your fiction pieces. So then do you actually write a fair bit of fiction?
I definitely write more poetry. Fiction, I love writing fiction, but it takes me a much longer time to craft.
Even with the shorter ones?
Yes.
Yeah. Why is that?
I have no idea. I think I probably a lot of the time just psych myself out, but the plot and the plot part of it is what I struggle with the most, probably.
Really?
Yeah.
I have to say, well, my degree's in poli-sci, so I don't have a degree in creative writing or anything of that degree, but I actually started with fiction, and yeah, I have to say, as much as I'm comfortable writing fiction, it seems so much easier and more natural to write poetry, and I have no idea why.
I don't either. I think it's different for most writers, but
yeah. So then in terms of your poetry, because a lot of what this podcast is kind of meant to do is to kind of bridge the gap between the supposed page and stage poet.
Right.
And you're, and I don't think this is unfair, a bit more of a page poet than performance poet.
I'm definitely more of a page poet. I'm not an actress.
Do you, when you do get to perform on stage, do you write things specific for the stage, or you kind of grab what you got and...
So I intentionally don't write for the stage or for the page. But when I moved back to Albuquerque and I started going to poetry slams, I was realizing, like, there's a lot more... I think I actually started going in Boston too. There was a lot more narrative and poetry and stage or performance poetry than I ever had previously seen or was aware of. And so I wanted to try to do that, to try to mix like my own vision of what poetry was and the craft of fiction and narrative. And so I ended up writing a lot more narrative poetry that I think work a little bit better on the stage than the page. And so that's what I was trying to do when I started working on Storm. And but I'm still, I would feel like more of a page poet.
And that's quite all right.
But I really like poetry slams and I like reading on stage. So I enjoy that aspect of it.
Maybe we'll get you to come over to the dark side.
Maybe.
I have to say that's where I got my start with poetry, was the slam poetry, just because not having a creative writing background, reading the quote-unquote traditional poetry tends to be a little tough for me to understand. And I'm starting to learn it, but yeah. And I want to apologize because there is folks outside doing all sorts of yard work, so you can probably hear that in the background. Let's see. Then, since you're a bit more of a traditional poet and you're the first one I've had on that's a bit closer to the traditional side, who are some of your influences or your kind of go-to poets that you like to read or hear?
So let's see, I love reading Jack Gilbert, Pablo Neruda.
I love Pablo Neruda. I was only introduced to him really recently.
Oh, he's a must read. Let's see, who else? Pablo Medina, who was one of my professors at Emerson. I really like reading Garcia Lorca.
I'm writing these down, that's why I'm quiet.
Okay. Some more contemporary poets that I also enjoy are Matthew Dickman, Libby Hart, who's an Australian poet who's really hard to find, but I really love her work. A Brazilian poet, Salgado Maranhão, and Campbell McGrath.
So many, right?
Yeah, there's. I can think of so many more.
That's awesome.
Joy Harjo.
Who?
Joy Harjo.
Joy Harjo. I think that one was recommended to me recently.
Yeah, she's some semi-local.
She the Native American?
Yes.
Yes. Oh,
she
right.
She lives in Oklahoma. She went to UNM.
She the one that wrote the book about the horses?
Yes.
Oh, I just finished that one. It was so weird because I think those poems are actually written so that whoever is reading it can kind of infer anything from their life. And at first, I have to say I was not a huge fan of it because I like to be kind of told what to feel in a poem. But and I like to kind of read into it, like you mentioned earlier, try to read into it and try to figure out what it's really about and all the layers. And that one, after looking up, kind of how she wrote it, it was really weird. And it took some getting used to that whole, like, I can make it whatever I want. And she was built it that way specifically.
Yeah, she was the first poet I think I ever really loved, and she writes a lot of narrative poetry also.
My first traditional poet that I really loved was Margaret Atwood. She wrote one about aging and sex, and it was weird that, being a middle-aged guy, falling in love with the first traditional poet talking about old age as a woman and what that means for love and sex and all of that.
And Margaret Atwood's so good.
Oh, she really is. Let's see. How about hearing another?
Okay. Wanderer. I've been trying to figure out the way the world was built, the way tectonics equal breath, in that same way moments of nebulae and volcanoes pass among us into some elemental ocean, as even as moments of picking up starfish in the surf, as sifting through stones in mountains. Pangaea, Rodinia, Laurasia, and Atlantis are names of infinite movement, and once they've released their seismic shutters, the plates mantle warm breathe jade, tectonic scarring, silty, snake green, and ocean veined. Once, a stranger told me that the Grand Canyon grows 1 centimeter each year, or crumbles, and that part of Guatemala is in California, and he's probably wrong about that, but I know the world is moving, he says, and tells me the snowy plateau of the Rockies is part of the Pacific subterranean, which forced herself up through the crust to become a continental core. I've stood in Chaco Canyon under the many-armed painted nova spinning in the shadow of a blinding sun, once the bed of a millennial ocean, epicontinental from the Arctic to the Mexican Gulf. The dirt roads that passed through here connected the home of a millennial people. Supernova light, once an outstretched sudden flame, now already past and already dimming. A planet is a wanderer, a wanderer. And now that years accord to me as space, I realize that most seconds I am not aware of where you are on this earth, in this stitched river of novas, this bed of planets. I've been trying to figure out the way the world was built, The ground is as old as creation. Earth, we call her. Earth, stone, dirt, ash, dust. Before the mountains there were oceans, before oceans a surface, and underneath the molten heart, pulsing, to set the beat of ours in bursts. Suddenly earth, suddenly starfish, suddenly breath, suddenly stars. The first cartographs are the mountains pressed with seashells, tattoos older than language. The words of the Creator are these mountains, dry ridges of deep ocean pressed by atmosphere. We are here with no compass but how we choose to draw our breath, soundless, plant our steps, mercurial. A star can live for 1,000,000 years and collapse in seconds, so heavy it suffocates into its own gravity. All brightness and suddenly neutrinos sculpting glow. From the surging remnants sings a radiant heartbeat. So fiercely alive it pulses through light years. The astronomers say that we hold comet debris in our bodies, and that in 4 billion years our dust will meet Andromeda, churning molecular pendula, falling into some new world, or perhaps into the roiling chaos of starbirth. I've been trying to imagine how the world was built, and when she stopped making herself to be formed by hands, bone brittle, soft blood hands, what it is she seeks from us when she is already made of limestone, of lava. All of this is happening even in the quiet spaces. And I don't know where on this earth you have buried your heart, but I know that it is bursting. Subterranean rupture. And a new space is made. A ladder of magma and suddenly tiny islands in the crawling ocean made of newborn earth and heart smoke, starfish spinning in the weeds below. You are here, your harbor. This is your breath.
Yay. Thank you. I get nerdy excited when people do poems that include astronomy.
Thanks.
I wanted to do astronomy and astrophysics sort of stuff in college, but then realized math was involved, so I didn't. In one of your other poems in Storm, and I don't know why I attached to this, but I have to ask about the windshield wipers and kind of both why you kind of gravitated towards them, and kind of clearly it was an important moment. But yeah, kind of what was up with the windshield wipers.
So this is the one line in the book that my dad always comments on. He's like, I don't understand that either. So the story of this poem it's in this windshield wiper story is from Arthur, the last poem in Storm. And there's a moment where it's like Arthur was, out of all 4 of these, probably the worst of the 5.
In what way?
It was the most rain, most wind.
The storm itself.
Yes, the storm itself. But I ended up driving with one of my friends. I think we went to a movie, and then we went to, she wanted to pick me up, so we weren't walking in the rain, but she didn't have windshield wipers. So we drove to a store that was open and bought windshield wipers. And I feel like it was an important moment because at the time, my friend Maciel and I were going through very similar situations, and we were kind of feeling displaced in that moment, and we didn't know what to do. So we found something to do, and then we realized, well, you can't drive without the wipers during the hurricane. That was silly. We should probably find some. But it was an important moment, and it was. And she did ask me. There's the line, "What will we someday we'll get out of this, and how will we talk about it? What do you think we'll remember?" And that was what I said: windshield wipers.
Yeah, it seems like you're kind of saying that. Yeah, the other stuff will change you, but that, it's not necessarily the most important.
Right, and you'll realize, you remember the moments of clarity, which, that's
windshield wipers are your clarity. No, oh my gosh, I didn't even notice that. That's awesome.
Thanks.
Then let's see. What is up next for you in terms of poetry or fiction or anything like that?
So, as far as fiction, I'm working on a new short story it's in its hopefully second and final draft now. That's set in Albuquerque. I really am happy with that, with this story. And for poetry, I'm working on a book of poems about volcanoes.
Nice.
So I'm moving a little bit different kind of storm element, but it's something that I've always been fascinated by. So I've been working on writing one poem about a different volcano every few weeks. So
Nice. What have you learned so far? Some of the
I've
cool
learned
things.
a lot. I've learned a lot about volcanic lightning, about the West Mesa volcanoes in Albuquerque.
Ooh, that's Three Sisters.
Three Sisters.
I love it.
I've learned a lot about legends and myths that are associated with them, the one in Mexico City and Kilimanjaro. So hopefully I'll get to visit some of them before the book is finished, but I'm not sure.
Nice. Let's see. Is there anything else you wanted to kind of talk about or share before we got to our icebreaker poems?
I would like to say that I'm for the Manzano Mountain Review, the literary journal that I'm the editor of. So we're open and accepting submissions. And for our first issue, we published about 18 or 19 New Mexican writers, which was really cool. So I just want to encourage everybody to look at our website, submit. We're looking for anything poetry, fiction, art, nonfiction. So check that out.
Excellent. And I'll put the links in the liner notes as soon as I learn how to do that.
Okay, thanks.
I did want to ask about the Brewers magazine that you write for, because I have to say I'm a bit of a beer nerd, and being in Albuquerque, you're kind of required to be. Yeah. Are you, or do you just kind of what sort of stuff do you write for them, or?
I'm definitely a beer nerd. I love beer.
Then I have to ask, what's your favorite?
I really like Founders, which is a brewery from Michigan.
I love Founders.
Yeah, I like almost everything I've ever had from them. When they're really happy that they're in New Mexico now.
Are they?
Yes. But I also do really enjoy New Mexican breweries and Marble. I also love Canteen and I'm blanking on the name of this one.
Not big on the IPAs then?
I do like IPAs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say La Cumbre is one of my favorites.
That's the one I was thinking of. I do love La Cumbre. So the Brewers Crew magazine is cool. It's they send me to different breweries to do different interviews with brewers and brewery owners and talk about industry and how it's shaping the economy in Albuquerque, and also what people are interested in, what they're drinking, what is the fascinations. And I really like that because there's so much art in beer that I learn a lot and also get to appreciate it a lot more.
I have to say that having spent about 4 years in Wisconsin, Milwaukee was my Boston.
Yeah.
That I'm really kind of sad that there aren't many dark beers here.
Yeah.
Can't find a good stout here outside of, La Cumbre's got a decent one, but yeah. All right. So that wasn't anything about poetry, but I like beer, so I had to ask. All right, so our icebreaker poem was a heinaku poem, which is kind of like a haiku, where it's basically one word in the first line, two words in the second line, and 3 words in the third line. And so, do you want to go first or second?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Snow in an orange fire sky.
Yes, excellent. And I have to say, all 3 folks that I've had on so far all of us have done wintry stuff.
That's good.
Because it's finally getting cold here.
Yes.
All right. And mine was Christmas, snow threatening everything but children.
Nice.
Excellent. Well, Kristian, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Thanks again to my guest, Kristian Ashley Macaron. Such a kind soul. I'm really glad I finally got to talk to her for more than just a few seconds. We'd seen each other a few times on stage, but outside of my asking her to come on the show, our paths never really crossed before today. You can find her chapbook, Storm, at swimmingwithelephants.com, on Amazon, or if you're in the Albuquerque area, at Bookworks, out on Rio Grande Boulevard. If you are interested in learning more about the lit journal that Kristian works for, Manzano Mountain Review, just go to manzanomountainreview.com. They are accepting fiction, poetry, visual art, and photography through February of 2018. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from and leave a review, please. You can head over to my Patreon page and search for Pen and Poet. If you want to support the show, you can do so with as little as $1 a month. This is not a cheap endeavor, and I often say that I do this so that I can listen to poetry, which is partially true, but in reality, it's to give an outlet to artists and let them share their work and be heard. If you want to be a guest on my show, you can hit me up via email at rene.mullen@gmail.com. That's rene.mullen@gmail.com, or on Twitter you can find me under Pen and Poet. Thanks for listening, and stay safe.